June 23, 1944, 0347 hours. German Army Group Center Headquarters, Minsk, Belarus. General Oberst Hans Jordan, commander of the Ninth Army, stared at the field telephone in his hand as if it had transformed into a venomous snake. The voice on the other end belonged to his chief intelligence officer, and the words emerging from the static-filled connection defied every principle of military logic Jordan had learned in 3 decades of service. "Sir, our entire southern flank has disappeared. The 337th Infantry Division, the 6th Infantry Division, the 31st Infantry Division. Gone. Not retreating, not repositioning. Gone." Jordan's leather chair creaked as he leaned forward. The smell of cigarette smoke and stale coffee thickened the bunker's recycled air. Outside, the pre-dawn darkness carried the distant rumble of artillery, but something was wrong with the sound. It wasn't coming from the east, where Soviet forces had been probing German lines for weeks. It was coming from behind them, from the west, from areas that had been secure German territory just 18 hours earlier. The impossible had happened. Marshal Georgy Zhukov had somehow moved 3 entire tank corps, over 200 tanks, and 300 Ziozarad men, through what German intelligence had deemed impassable swampland, and encircled the entire German Ninth Army before they even realized what was happening. The story begins 3 weeks earlier, in the cramped planning bunker beneath the Kremlin, where Soviet high command had been wrestling with a problem that seemed to have no solution. Operation Bagration, the massive summer offensive designed to destroy German Army Group Center, required speed and surprise on a scale that had never been attempted. The German defensive positions stretched across 450 miles of fortified territory, anchored by major cities like Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk. Each city had been transformed into a fortress with interlocking fields of fire, pre-registered artillery coordinates, and garrison forces that had spent months preparing for exactly this type of assault. Wehrmacht intelligence estimated that any Soviet offensive would require at least 2 weeks of preliminary bombardment, followed by months of grinding urban warfare. They were wrong by a factor of approximately 72 hours. The key to Zhukov's plan lay in terrain that German planners had dismissed as militarily irrelevant. The Pripyat marshes, a vast wetland region south of the main German defensive line, stretched for nearly 300 miles of boggy ground, twisted waterways, and dense forest. German engineers had surveyed the area in 1941 and concluded that moving large formations through the marshes would be impossible during summer months when water levels were highest. Soviet engineers, working with local partisans who had lived in the region for generations, reached a different conclusion. Not only was movement possible, but the marshes could serve as a highway for tanks if you knew exactly where to go and exactly how to do it. Captain Dmitry Lelyushenko, chief engineer for the 2nd Guards Tank Army, had spent 6 months studying German intelligence reports captured during the winter offensive. What he discovered changed everything. German reconnaissance had surveyed the marshes during the wettest part of the year, testing ground pressure at locations where water pooled deepest. But local hunters and fishermen knew something German engineers didn't. Beneath the surface water lay a network of raised ground, ancient paths that had been used for centuries by people moving through the wetlands. These paths weren't visible from aerial reconnaissance because they lay just inches beneath the surface, invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. Lelyushenko's surveys, conducted with partisan guides who had grown up in the marshes, revealed that tank columns could traverse the entire swampland in less than 36 hours if they followed these hidden routes. The catch was that they would have to move at night, in complete radio silence, with no reconnaissance flights, no artillery spotters, and no margin for error. A single wrong turn would sink an entire tank column in 20 feet of marsh water. The plan that emerged from these surveys was audacious beyond belief. 3 tank corps, the 2nd Guards, 5th Guards, and 11th Guards, would disappear into the Pripyat marshes on the evening of June 22nd. They would emerge 36 hours later, 60 miles behind German lines, having completed the largest armored movement through supposedly impassable terrain in military history. Meanwhile, Soviet infantry would launch frontal attacks against German fortified positions, drawing attention away from the marshes and convincing German commanders that they were facing a conventional assault. The deception began at 0400 hours on June 22nd, with the largest artillery bombardment in Soviet history. Over 31 EUO-Zarand guns and mortars opened fire simultaneously across the entire front, creating a wall of sound that could be heard in Berlin. German radio operators, their communications equipment overwhelmed by the electromagnetic interference from thousands of simultaneous explosions, struggled to maintain contact with forward units as Soviet infantry launched human wave attacks against every major defensive position. From the German perspective, this was exactly what they had been expecting: a massive, costly, straightforward assault that would exhaust Soviet reserves against prepared defensive positions. What they didn't know was that the entire bombardment was a feint designed to mask the sound of tank engines starting up 60 miles to the south. At exactly 0615 hours, as German artillery began responding to the Soviet bombardment, the first T-34 tanks of the 2nd Guards Tank Army slipped into the Pripyat marshes. Each tank carried specially designed wooden planks attached to their tracks, spreading their weight across the soft ground and providing additional traction on the muddy paths. Tank commanders had been issued maps hand-drawn by local partisans, showing not just the route but specific landmarks: a lightning-struck oak tree, a submerged stone bridge, a cluster of abandoned fishing huts. Miss one landmark, and an entire column would disappear beneath the marsh water. The movement through the marshes tested every limit of Soviet tank crews' endurance and skill. Tank drivers had to maintain exact distances between vehicles, close enough to follow the tank ahead through the darkness, but far enough apart that if one tank broke through the surface, it wouldn't drag others down with it. Radio silence meant that communication was limited to hand signals and prearranged light codes. Engines were throttled to minimum power to reduce noise, which meant that if a tank got stuck, the crew would have to abandon it rather than risk alerting German listening posts. The air inside the tanks became thick and humid as crews sweated through their uniforms in the close, stifling atmosphere of the closed vehicles. The smell of diesel fumes mixed with the organic odor of decomposing vegetation and stagnant water that seeped through every seal and gasket. Tank commanders, standing in their open hatches to navigate by landmarks, felt mosquitoes and other insects attacking any exposed skin while they strained to identify the next waypoint in the pre-dawn darkness. The sound of water lapping against tank tracks and the occasional splash of a displaced animal were the only noises that marked the passage of over 200 armored vehicles through terrain that German intelligence had declared tank-proof. By 1800 hours on June 23rd, the lead elements of the 2nd Guards Tank Army had reached their designated positions 15 miles behind German lines. Tank crews, exhausted from 30 hours of continuous movement through the marshes, immediately began establishing defensive positions around key road junctions and communication centers. The plan called for the 3 tank corps to emerge from the marshes simultaneously at dawn on June 24th, cutting off German Army Group Center's primary supply lines and escape routes before German commanders even realized what was happening. But Zhukov had built flexibility into his timeline. As reports filtered back from partisan spotters indicating that German reserves were being drawn toward the frontal attacks in the north, he made the decision that would define the operation. Rather than wait for dawn, the Soviet Tank Corps would launch their attacks immediately, under cover of darkness, catching German forces in the middle of their evening meal and daily administrative routines. If you want to discover how a blacksmith's son from rural Russia outmaneuvered the most experienced general staff in Europe and changed the entire course of the Eastern Front, please leave your like on this video. This helps us share more forgotten stories from the archives that shaped our world. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, so you don't miss the next episode where we dive deep into military history that textbooks overlook. The first indication that something catastrophic was happening reached German Army Group Center headquarters at 21:47 hours when radio contact was lost with the supply depot at Slutsk. The communications officer initially attributed the silence to equipment failure, a common occurrence during Soviet artillery bombardments, when electromagnetic interference disrupted radio frequencies. But when contact was also lost with depots at Starie Dorogi and Kletsk, all within a 15-minute window, a different explanation began to emerge. These weren't random equipment failures. Someone was systematically destroying German rear area installations with coordinated precision that suggested detailed knowledge of German logistics networks. General Major Klaus Brenner, Army Group Center's intelligence chief, spread a map across the briefing table and began marking the locations of lost communication points. What he saw made his blood run cold. The pattern of attacks formed a perfect semicircle around the rear of the German Ninth Army, cutting off every major supply route and communication line. Either Soviet forces had achieved the impossible and moved large formations through the Pripet marshes, or German intelligence had missed the largest troop movement in the history of warfare. The truth became undeniable at 22:34 hours, when Lieutenant Colonel Wolfgang Reinhardt, commanding the 31st Infantry Division's rear guard, transmitted what would become the most famous radio message of the Eastern Front. Request immediate reinforcement. Am under attack by at least 2 tank regiments from direction of Slutsk. Repeat, tanks are attacking from Slutsk. This should be impossible. Slutsk is 40 kilometers behind our lines. The radio crackled with static for several seconds before Reinhardt's voice returned, now strained and urgent. Correction to previous message. Tank strength estimated at brigade level. They are everywhere. How did they get behind us? That transmission was the last communication received from the 31st Infantry Division. Within 6 hours, the entire unit had been destroyed or captured, along with its complete complement of heavy weapons, vehicles, and supplies. The same fate was simultaneously befalling German units across a front that stretched for over 100 miles. Soviet tank crews, emerging from the marshes with the fury of warriors who had endured 36 hours in hell, overwhelmed German rear area units that had been expecting a quiet evening of equipment maintenance and letter writing. At a 3:12 hours on June 24th, the secure telephone line between Army Group Center and the German High Command in Berlin carried a conversation that would be analyzed by military historians for decades. General Feldmarschall Ernst Busch, commander of Army Group Center, was attempting to explain the impossible to Generaloberst Heinz Guderian, chief of the German General Staff. Herr General, I am reporting the complete encirclement of the Ninth Army by Soviet armored forces that appeared in our rear areas without warning. Our intelligence estimates indicate at least 3 tank corps, approximately 1-200 armored vehicles, moved through the Pripet marshes undetected. Guderian's response, preserved in Wehrmacht archives captured after the war, revealed the degree of shock at the highest levels of German command. Herr Feldmarschall, you are asking me to believe that the Bolsheviks moved 300,000 men and 1-200 tanks through swampland that our engineers declared impassable. You are asking me to believe that our intelligence services, our aerial reconnaissance, and our radio intercept capabilities all failed simultaneously. You are asking me to believe in magic. Busch's reply would become legendary among German officers for its combination of military precision and barely contained desperation. Herr General, I am not asking you to believe anything. I am reporting that magic appears to be exactly what we are facing. The scope of the disaster became clear as dawn broke on June 24th, and German aerial reconnaissance finally provided visual confirmation of what radio intercepts had been suggesting throughout the night. Luftwaffe pilots, flying desperate reconnaissance missions over territory that had been secure German rear areas just hours earlier, reported scenes that defied military comprehension. Soviet T-34 tanks were rolling down highways that connected major German supply depots, encountering no resistance because no resistance had been planned for attacks from those directions. German supply columns, loaded with ammunition and fuel intended for forward units, were being systematically destroyed by Soviet forces that seemed to appear from nowhere and disappear just as quickly. Most shocking of all, Soviet tanks were occupying crossroads and bridges that represented the only escape routes for German forces trapped in forward defensive positions. The Ninth Army, which had begun the day with over 165 EUO-0 men, was completely cut off from supply lines and reinforcement. They could fight with the ammunition they had on hand, but when that ran out, surrender would be their only option. How many of you have a grandfather, father, or uncle who served and never spoke about what they experienced? These stories are disappearing from memory. Leave a comment now saying just, "My family served." When you comment, you're not just honoring your family, you're helping preserve these forgotten moments of history for future generations. Let's create a living memorial here in the comments. The German response to Zhukov's encirclement revealed both the strengths and fatal weaknesses of Wehrmacht doctrine in 1944. German military training emphasized aggressive counterattacks and the immediate restoration of broken front lines, principles that had served them well during the early years of the war, when they possessed superior mobility and firepower. But those same principles became liabilities when facing an opponent who had achieved total surprise and overwhelming local superiority. General Oberst Jordan, commanding the trapped Ninth Army, received direct orders from Berlin to attack in all directions simultaneously and restore contact with Army Group Center at any cost. These orders, transmitted via emergency radio frequencies that Soviet intercept units were monitoring in real time, provided Zhukov with detailed intelligence about German intentions, while revealing the confusion and desperation at the highest levels of German command. Jordan's staff officers, studying maps that showed Soviet forces between them and every possible escape route, began drafting recommendations for a fighting withdrawal to defensible positions. But fighting withdrawal required somewhere to withdraw to, and Zhukov's positioning of his tank corps had eliminated every viable option. The tactical brilliance of Zhukov's operation became evident in the details of how Soviet forces positioned themselves after emerging from the marshes. Rather than simply occupying road junctions and supply depots, Soviet tank commanders had studied German logistics manuals captured during previous operations and positioned their forces at precisely the points where German doctrine required supply trucks to refuel and resupply. This meant that when German units attempted to break out of the encirclement, they encountered Soviet forces at maximum strength, while their own vehicles were running low on fuel and ammunition. The psychological impact on German troops was devastating. Soldiers who had been told for months that Soviet forces were incapable of sophisticated tactical maneuvers found themselves surrounded by enemies who demonstrated superior planning, better intelligence, and more effective use of terrain than anything they had previously encountered. Radio intercepts from trapped German units, preserved in Soviet archives, reveal the progression from confusion to disbelief to despair as German soldiers realized the magnitude of their situation. The collapse of German resistance proceeded with mechanical inevitability once Soviet forces had achieved complete encirclement. German units, cut off from supply lines and unable to coordinate their movements, began surrendering in battalion-sized groups rather than face destruction in piecemeal engagements they could not win. By June 27th, just 4 days after the operation began, Soviet forces had captured over 130 ZOZOden German prisoners, including 22 generals, along with more than 2 Zeros and artillery pieces, 800 tanks, and enough small arms to equip multiple Soviet divisions. The speed of the collapse shocked even Soviet commanders who had planned the operation. Zhukov's staff had estimated that reducing the encircled German forces would require 2 weeks of heavy fighting. Instead, organized German resistance collapsed in less than 96 hours, as unit after unit recognized the futility of fighting without supply lines, reinforcement, or hope of relief. The few German units that attempted to break out of the encirclement found themselves facing Soviet forces that had been specifically positioned to channel breakout attempts into prepared kill zones where concentrated artillery and tank fire made escape impossible. The international impact of Zhukov's encirclement operation extended far beyond the immediate military consequences on the Eastern Front. Allied intelligence services, monitoring German radio traffic and diplomatic communications, immediately recognized that the destruction of an entire German army in less than a week represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power. British and American planners, preparing for the Normandy invasion that would occur just days later, revised their estimates of German defensive capabilities based on the demonstrated ability of Soviet forces to achieve surprise on such a massive scale. German allies, particularly Hungary and Romania, began secret negotiations for separate peace agreements as the reality of German military vulnerability became impossible to ignore. Most significantly, the operation demonstrated that the Wehrmacht's reputation for tactical superiority, built during the early years of the war, was no longer warranted. Soviet forces had not merely defeated a German army through superior numbers or equipment. They had outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and outfought German forces using tactics that German generals had declared impossible. The interrogation records of captured German officers provide insight into how the encirclement was perceived by those who experienced it firsthand. General Major Friedrich Sixt, commander of the 6th Infantry Division, described the operation as like being struck by lightning from a clear sky. We had every reason to believe our rear areas were secure. Our intelligence indicated that large Soviet formations were engaged in frontal attacks against our prepared positions. The possibility that 3 tank corps could move through the Pripyat marshes was never considered because our engineers had declared such movement impossible. When asked how German intelligence had failed so completely, Sixt's response revealed the fundamental problem with German military thinking in 1944. We assumed that the Bolsheviks would fight according to our understanding of military science. We never considered that they might possess knowledge of local terrain that exceeded our own technical analysis. Other captured officers expressed similar themes. German military doctrine, based on technical analysis and theoretical modeling, had been defeated by Soviet forces that combined technical capability with local knowledge and tactical creativity that German planners had not anticipated. The human cost of Zhukov's operation fell disproportionately on Soviet tank crews who had endured the grueling passage through the Pripyat marshes. Medical records from Soviet field hospitals reveal that tank crews suffered from a range of ailments related to their 36 hours in the marshes. Diesel fume poisoning affected nearly every crew member who had spent extended periods in closed tanks. Severe dehydration was universal, as crews had been unable to replenish water supplies during the movement. Insect bites and rashes covered any exposed skin, and many crew members suffered from what military doctors described as extreme nervous exhaustion from the stress of navigating through terrain where a single mistake would result in death by drowning. But the same medical records also document the extraordinary esprit de corps among Soviet tank crews who had accomplished something that would be studied in military academies for generations. Junior Lieutenant Alexei Volkov, tank commander in the 5th Guards Tank Army, wrote to his family describing the operation as the most terrible and most glorious 36 hours of my life. We proved that Soviet tankers can go anywhere and defeat any enemy when we fight for our motherland. The strategic consequences of the encirclement operation extended throughout the summer of 1944 and fundamentally altered the trajectory of the Eastern Front. The destruction of the German 9th Army created a gap in Wehrmacht lines that Soviet forces exploited to advance over 300 miles westward in less than 6 weeks. German Army Group Center, which had been the strongest defensive formation on the Eastern Front, effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. The loss of experienced officers and non-commissioned officers who had been captured during the encirclement could never be replaced, as Germany no longer possessed the training infrastructure or time necessary to develop replacements of equivalent quality. Most importantly, the demonstration that Soviet forces could achieve surprise on such a scale forced German high command to redistribute reserves and defensive positions throughout occupied territory, weakening every sector of the front in an attempt to guard against similar operations. The psychological impact on German forces was equally significant, as soldiers who had believed in Wehrmacht invincibility found themselves facing enemies who had demonstrated superior tactical capability and operational planning. Zhukov's personal role in planning and executing the operation established him as the preeminent Soviet military commander and validated the Red Army's evolution from the disorganized force that had nearly been destroyed in 1941. Post-war interviews with Soviet staff officers reveal that the Marsh Passage operation had been Zhukov's personal concept, developed through months of detailed study of German intelligence reports and extensive consultation with local partisans who possessed knowledge that no staff college could provide. The operation demonstrated principles that would influence military thinking for decades: the importance of local knowledge over technical analysis, the value of deception operations that convince enemies to focus on threats in the wrong direction, and the devastating effectiveness of operational surprise when combined with overwhelming force applied at the decisive point. Military academies throughout the world would study the operation as an example of how superior planning and execution could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles and achieve victory against numerically equivalent forces. The fate of the German officers captured during the operation varied significantly based on their treatment of Soviet prisoners and civilians during the occupation. General Oberst Jordan, who had maintained relatively humane policies regarding prisoner treatment, survived Soviet captivity and returned to Germany in 1952. General Major Brenner, whose intelligence units had been involved in anti-partisan operations that resulted in civilian casualties, died in Soviet custody in 1947. The vast majority of German soldiers captured during the encirclement survived the war and returned home between 1948 and 1955, as Soviet policy toward regular Wehrmacht personnel became increasingly lenient. Many of these veterans would later write memoirs describing the operation as the moment when they realized that Germany could not win the war. Their accounts, published throughout the 1960s and 1970s, provided detailed perspectives on how the encirclement was experienced by those who lived through it and contributed to historical understanding of the operation's significance. Zhukov himself rarely spoke publicly about the Marsh Passage operation, considering it just one of many actions necessary for Soviet victory. In his memoirs, published in 1969, he devoted only 3 pages to the operation that had destroyed an entire German army, focusing instead on the months of preparation and intelligence gathering that had made the surprise possible. However, private papers discovered after Zhukov's death in 1974 reveal his personal satisfaction with an operation that had vindicated his belief that Soviet forces could outfight German units when properly led and equipped. He particularly noted the performance of Soviet tank crews, who had volunteered for an operation they knew might result in their deaths if navigation errors sent their vehicles into 20 feet of marsh water. The courage of these men, Zhukov wrote, proved that the Red Army had become a professional fighting force capable of defeating any enemy anywhere in the world. The Pripyat marshes themselves returned to their natural state within months of the operation's conclusion, with local partisans removing the wooden planks and other equipment left behind by Soviet tank crews. Today, the area remains largely unchanged from its appearance in 1944, with the same hidden paths beneath the surface water that made Zhukov's operation possible. Local museums in Belarus maintain exhibits describing the operation, but few visitors understand the scale of what was accomplished or the degree of planning required to move 200 tanks through terrain that military engineers had declared impassable. The crossroads and supply depots where German forces made their last stand have been rebuilt and incorporated into modern transportation networks, with few physical traces remaining of the battles that destroyed an entire army. However, military historians continue to study the operation as an example of how innovative thinking, detailed preparation, and tactical surprise can overcome seemingly impossible odds when combined with forces willing to risk everything for victory. The lessons of Zhukov's encirclement operation influenced military doctrine throughout the Cold War and continue to shape modern understanding of armored warfare. The demonstration that large formations could move through terrain previously considered impassable led military planners worldwide to reconsider assumptions about natural obstacles and defensive positioning. The operation also validated the importance of local knowledge and partisan cooperation in military planning, principles that would be applied in conflicts from Vietnam to Afghanistan. Most significantly, the operation proved that technical superiority and theoretical military science could be overcome by opponents who combined traditional knowledge with modern equipment and tactics. This lesson would be relearned repeatedly in subsequent conflicts, where established military powers found themselves defeated by enemies who understood local conditions better than foreign technical experts. If this story moved you the same way it moves us, do us a favor. Leave your like on this video. Each like tells YouTube to share this story with more people who need to know about forgotten heroes, like the tank crews who risked everything in the Pripyat marshes. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. We're rescuing stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about tactical genius that changed history, courage in impossible circumstances, and ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things when their countries needed them most. Real people, real heroism, real history that deserves to be remembered. Leave a comment now and tell us where you're watching from. United States, Russia, Germany, Poland, Belarus. Our community spans the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for ensuring that Marshal Zhukov and the tank crews who followed him into the marshes are not forgotten by history. These men changed the world, and you're helping make sure their story survives.